Yeah, so the prompt here was theoretical perspectives, practical applications, or activities that we find useful for generating and facilitating robust public discourse across any range of contexts. Many of y'all have heard me talk a lot about some of these things, and some of you, I know you just got introduced to me. So I was trying to do something that would work for both, right? That wouldn't be just the same thing a lot of y'all have heard. And I have been working on some new things here. So not a surprise to the people that know me that I'm going to talk a little bit about wicked problems, but I'm going to try to give a really quick intro to that. If it's new to you and I go way too fast, I'm going to provide a link to some resources if you want to dig in a little bit more. But then I want to apply some new things I'm really thinking about on wicked problems and a new kind of typology I'm developing, and then hopefully actually apply it to equity. Some things I'm doing a lot of work now with the International City Managers County Association to think about how do we look at equity as a value and not try to push back on it dividing us so much and help us to come together to deal with clear issues and inequities that we're dealing with in our community. Part of my background, my academic background, is actually in rhetoric and argumentation. Kine Perlman, for those who are rhetoricians, was really influential to me as a young scholar, particularly kind of how we talked about values and really the power of values as these powerful tools of persuasion, often, unfortunately, tools for manipulation, tools that divide us, tools that work really well to mobilize our side, but do it in a way that create a lot of conflict. But then possibly, particularly with how I try to use wicked problems, tools that can bring us together, that can help us deliberate, that can help us work through tough issues, right? So my view of wicked problems, again, this is going to be the 2-minute version just to kind of get people going if you haven't heard me before. I like to think, instead of wicked problems being a category or type of problems, more of a lens through which to see problems. So a tool in your toolkit that you can step back and say, if I look at this issue as a wicked problem, how does that change the conversation? How might that open up space for us to think differently, and particularly to come together across perspectives to deal with our shared problems better? So this is one example. I create these wicked problem slides that I'm trying to, bring out the underlying values and kind of put them on the table and help people assume that people are coming to things from a good perspective, right? Part of the wicked problems framework is, instead of assuming problems are caused by wicked people or bad people with bad values, the wickedness isn't the problem. We want lots of things, but those things don't fit together very well, right? So I try to spark the kind of conversations that we need, this long-term balancing conversation. How do we as a community balance these things as much as possible? Short-term, we might have some pretty strong recalibrating conversations. This is where deliberation and activism can kind of come together or overlap, right? That we're saying one value is dominating too much, or maybe one's been left behind, and we need to kind of rebalance things. Or ideally, we have these transcending conversations. We tap into human creativity and find new ways, win-wins, right? Ways that to shift traditional adversarial values into kind of more collaborative ones in a while. But those conversations are not natural. Our brains are not wired for deliberation. Our brains are much more wired for polarization and outrage. So people that do take the simple route, pick one value at a time to frame it as I'm for a value, and people that disagree with me or against that value are very successful, right? People are getting really, really rich framing things in simple ways that divide us. So a lot of my work is, okay, how do we really think about the underlying values to tough issues and use that to hopefully kind of set up a very different conversation, right? So ultimately, what I try to do in my work is shift from the easy assumption of wicked people to put the wickedness in the problem. That shifts us from an adversarial mode, which I know from the research on social psychology, our brains are not working. We're in adversarial mode where they're just to defend or attack, to collaborative mode. When we do that, we switch from sparking the worst of human nature to bring out the best of human nature. And for me, going back to my argumentation background of caring about good information and how can good information help us make better decisions. When we're in adversarial mode, information doesn't work, facts don't work. But when we're in collaborative mode, all of a sudden they can work a lot better, right? So that's a really quick version of some of my kind of basic thoughts. This is the new stuff, and I'll post a link on the chat right when I'm done speaking that has a link to the PowerPoint, so y'all can dig in a little bit more, and a link to some other resources, videos that I do on wicked problems and social psychology if what I just did was way, way too fast. But I continue to be concerned for the last 50 years when people frame things simply as only one value is relevant. Persuasively, it works, right? But often I would say works through manipulation and has a lot of negative consequences to the quality of our conversation. So I've been playing with this. This is new. This is I think the second time I've presented it to someone. I haven't published it yet. So eager to get feedback and thoughts from people. But looking at, okay, how are people using values with a certain issue? So that first column is when they primarily can use a solitary value. They're framing things as only one value is relevant, right? Which is probably the most common in some ways. The second column is, often we kind of talk about two values. We're comparing values. Sometimes that's fair, sometimes that's not. And then the third column is when we talk inherently about many values. Obviously, a lot of my work tends to shift to the right. And then the vertical rows here, so the top row is, right now, I'm still playing with these terms, is simple framing. When we're framing it in very simple ways, often strategically doing it because we know it's going to mobilize our side. And then sometimes we're not strategically doing, right? It seems like the best way to do it. That's the way our kind of brain works. Intermediate gets a little bit better. They're complicating things. And then on the bottom is the more nuanced framing. Generally with my work, I do kind of assume going to the right and going down is good. So in a lot of ways, I'm shifting from that simple top left to the wicked problems on the bottom right. But I also won't say that that's inherently positive, right? I certainly see sometimes the need to frame things in more strategic ways. From an activist perspective, from a social movement perspective, sometimes it does call for things that might be higher up, right? So there's pros and cons to everything as we go. So yeah, so you can kind of see some examples. I don't want to walk through the chart too much because I guess I got 4 minutes. I can do a little bit here. I've got the timer on me, so I will cap it at 10 minutes for sure to kind of respect everyone else's time. So yeah, the problematic I've already kind of mentioned, and we see this from lots of different perspectives, is that top left. You pick one value, you don't define that value, and you're inherently kind of making this assumption that I'm for a good value, and anyone who disagrees with me is against that value. The intermediate framing, so the left middle, is when you actually define a term, right? Once, Perlman taught us, once you move from an abstract term like freedom or equality to actually talking about what you mean by that or what are the implications of that, it starts getting a little bit complicated, right? It's not universally accepted. So then you're allowing the possibility of some pushback or some trade-offs or some tensions. And then the bottom, for me is kind of looking at a value like an Aristotelian virtue. That values, and this works for some values, not all, but particularly works for things like justice or fairness or sustainability, that the value isn't something you maximize, it's a balance. It's trying to find that ideal mean between extremes. So you're recognizing that value as a complex thing that you need to kind of work on, right? On the second column, we often frame things strategically as, two things, one's good and one's bad, right? And obviously that works to mobilize our base. It doesn't work to help us actually deal with the issue better, right? The more intermediate framing, and a lot of y'all are probably familiar with some of these equity versus equality kind of memes. By the way, I've had wonderful conversations in my classes engaging all these different memes and using these to spark really good conversations, right? So while I push back on the simplicity of these memes, I see the value of them to help us really spark some good conversations about what those words means, right? But in this case, so we're picking two positive values, which is good. But for me, at least, with most of those memes, they're framing equity in a very positive way and inequality in a really negative way. And the actual situation is a kind of simplistic situation that sets up equity. So, without engaging it in a productive way, I think it's problematic. And then the bottom, a lot of y'all have heard me talk. Oh, I'll add this to the resource page as well. I use polarity management as a concept when there's a particular tension between two values is a really useful way to dig into those tensions. So the most nuanced way to talk about two values is as a polarity to manage. That really helps you see both the upside and the downside and the danger when either of those two dominate a little too much. So then finally, the third column, the top right, comes up with lots of situations where I do a lot of work with strategic plans. And strategic plans like to come up with, here's our value statements. Here's the 10 values we hold. And too often they have 10 values, eloquent statements about those 10 values, but never recognize the tension between those 10 values, right? And that's where the heart of the work is, right? That following, honoring some of those values, make it harder to honor others. That's where the real work is. And most strategic plans avoid that, right? The intermediate framing is that notion of recalibrating. You might have lots of values, but you're recognizing that we need to shift them, right? So yes, you might be a strong advocate for equity. I frame this in terms of elevating equity as a productive kind of way of thinking about equity, but you're recognizing equity as one value among many, right? But you're making a persuasive or an activist view for increasing the focus on equity. And then the bottom right is the traditional wicked problems that there's lots of values. So I know I'm out of time. I'm just going to show you really quick. So different ways of thinking about equity. A simple framing is it's just equity, right? You're either for it or against it, or you might have the debate, so equity versus equality, framing equality kind of in a negative way. Or you could have a centering equity. So you're saying there's lots of values, but you're making equity more important. You're centering it, a larger font, saying that we're going to prioritize equity. Or you can see equity as one of many, but making the argument that we need to elevate equity compared to those. Or you can have more of a broader, instead of focusing on equity, you're saying public administration, we're trying to balance all these values, equity being one of them. So those are all different ways of talking about the inherent values to how we run cities, which is one of the things I focus on. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Martín. That was terrific. Rhonda, I believe you're up.
Hi, everyone. I prepared some handouts for you that I'll get into whatever format you'll share documents with, but I'll take you through them as if they're slides. Today, I wanted to focus on where I've seen stuck points in capacity building around facilitators. And I hate to frame things in terms of stuck points. It feels very negative. But in our work, we frequently are trying to take people to what you might consider professional levels of facilitation skill. So much nuance, so much ability to be subtle, so much ability to deploy skills immediately. And to be honest, often the audience is not able to meet those goals because of their starting points. And so I'm going to talk about some of the stuck points that we see in the hopes that maybe you'll share some of them that you see in your work. And then I'm going to talk about the language we've used in our work, especially because a lot of times we are associated with justice work while also being associated with multiple points of view. And so we're going to try to talk about it from that framework and see how you land as we share these stuck points and how we talk about them. Just because, to say it plainly, sometimes I feel like the places that we're getting stuck are a little bit beneath our capacity collectively, and we could actually get out of them. And that might resonate a bit with what Martín said, is we might be seeing things a bit too simply. So I'm going to begin to share screen if that's possible now. And forgive me for the cross-referencing of disciplines here. I'm trained as a sociologist with a strong interest in social psychology. And so I wanted to bring you to the work of Dr. James Marcia, like Erickson, a developmental psychologist who talks about identity frameworks. And we have no qualms about thinking about this in terms of readiness for conversations. And I wanted to share this because it's really changed our work in the last few years in terms of figuring out where to go, who to talk to, and what to expect from that conversation. So if you're not familiar with Dr. James Marcia, this is one of the theorists who has given some of the basis for what people might call identity development. Some of this is about becoming the adult that you are in terms of your viewpoints. And it's a simple four square with two axes. The axes that are presented in this four square are, one is either highly committed to a role in their identity, which is the horizontal axis here, meaning you've either committed to a role or you've not committed to a role. And then second, the role of education is you thoroughly explored that role or not explored that role. So I'm going to give you the framework that we've been using. So I have the fun job of teaching about anti-racism with people of all mindsets. And so if I'm applying this to the idea of anti-racist identity, which is a loaded, huge thing. In this four square, somebody who is in role achievement may have already committed to being anti-racist. And this is a huge question. That's a huge commitment to take on. And they've also explored this. They've gotten those books out of the library. They've read them. They've been in deep conversation. Someone in role moratorium maybe has not reached a committed role. They've explored, they've gotten the books out of the library, but they're still not certain where they are here. Someone in role foreclosure, and many of you who are full-time educators are familiar with this group, they're highly committed to a role, but the exploration in education isn't in place yet for them to talk knowledgeably with others about how they've committed. And often this is from influential others. So this is the role of an oversimplified public news media where misinformation runs rampant, or parents who are just getting by. And then finally, role diffusion in the lower right-hand corner, in which someone has not yet reached a committed role, perhaps in terms of their identity, but also has not explored yet. And for educators, these are wonderful folks to be in contact with. So our job at the Sustained Dialogue Institute is often training folks within higher ed about how to have conversations that are productive across difference, just like you all, often through dialogue. We have started to really be clear with folks that as a facilitator, I'm going to zoom in on the fine print here. As a facilitator, it's not important to take on the pressure of believing your choices are likely to cause the shifts here. This is the role of faculty members like many of you. Some people don't have any readiness, and studies continually point us to readiness as a key indicator about whether someone is ready to explore pieces that relate to identity. And so this is an under talked about area of, everyone knows that it can feel really wrong to have a mandatory session where people walk in and they've been forced into something, but they can't always articulate this. And so I'm going to talk about this as a stuck point. Almost every traditional college-age student that I meet with and encounter is working from the framework of, if you put them in a room together, the educational wheels will turn and someone's readiness or will result from previous resistance. But that's not how development works. It's actually shifts the ability to collaborate for those who are actually in the room, who actually might have their own points of resistance that won't be explored if someone else is there. So what does this look like for a practitioner? It means that we've taken a strong stand against mandatory stuff. We don't do anything mandatory. And this is not revolutionary from our background as a conflict resolution program, meaning our model developed from international relations where only people who are willing to come to the table would come to the table. And so we've had to teach very clearly the role of diplomacy in people's readiness, even when it comes to US modes of understanding multiculturalism. And so I want you to have this framework. This has clearly been adapted for this purpose because Dr. James Marcia is talking about identity as a whole, not just talking about commitment to a certain type of understanding of identity. But I want you to think about this critically, especially if you're someone who ascribes to this idea of, if we are exposed to each other, then we'll slowly get to this civic place where we've sort of moderated each other's beliefs in a way that's made us intellectually more refined. It's not necessarily the case. So what do you do, and what do we do with the stuck point is the next piece. This is maybe oversimplified, but we started with every training we do. For instance, we do an anti-racism training. We have a whole pathway designed for who doesn't agree with this at all, who's not into this at all, who has never thought about this at all. And functionally, we're separating out these four groups as much as possible, not because they can't interact and there's not dynamic conversation to be had from them interacting, but because they're all on a very different journey. And so when we bring together folks who are in role foreclosure within an anti-racism workshop, they're surprised that they don't have to explain what they're committing to. They're literally not committing to anything. That's the definition of this group. And so one of the things that we've done is make sure that we're always staffed for at least 4 areas whenever we're bringing people together. And that's a preparation thing for facilitators that most people don't have the luxury of, but we don't actually bring people together unless we can give them freedom to be in their role, however they define it. Quick note about this particular stuck point. Nobody likes these, likes to be labeled in a static category. So we would never use this bit of language for people in terms of their positions or ideas. But it is worth noting that people do sort themselves into, yeah, I have explored this very much, or no, I haven't committed to this. And they've been, we don't know exactly how honest they've been in these separations, but we do know that we're not doing the work of forcing. And that non-forcing work looks very similar to the work of Dr. Harold Saunders, bringing disparate groups who were previously in ethnic conflict together. And so that's one way we maintain integrity to the international relations and diplomatic side of this work, while also confronting some of the very entrenched US wicked problems. The next stuck point I want to share with you, this one's a bit esoteric, but I decided, I took really seriously this idea that we would share and think together. Many of us are familiar with thinking about social identity, but I've started switching from teaching just about, hey, here are some of the key dividers and wicked problems around identity to, let's just talk about them in terms of what is labeled here as the blue level. And while these are supposed to be friendly to those who experience color blindness, I want to let you know that I'll read these aloud in the blue level. We often find students who have had some background in civic engagement. And so the idea of like, I want to work in my lifetime on differences in educational inputs, or I want to work in my lifetime about disparities in employment and hiring, or I want to work in my lifetime about the impact of the physical environment, what people might call entrenched problems around climate, asbestos, lead and paint, chemicals and water. While doing equity and identity work, we have been focusing for the last 3 years on always returning to, how does this lead to material changes in these areas, if any? Like, what does this conversation do materially around, for instance, health, wellness, and stress? Who benefits from this conversation? And while this might be too functional for those of you who are thinking of this in the more broad ways, it's really important for us to do, especially with some of the college students we work with, because it can be very attractive for them to get into traps around identity. So an example trap around identity is reviewing all of your language for things that could be oppressive and then just replacing words one by one. It's wonderful work to do if you're a public facing figure, but does it actually change anyone's poverty or access to wealth? No, it absolutely may not, unless you've really actually taken some collaborative or action steps around it. And so we've been trying to train some of the more identity-focused students that we work with, that the actions we take try to name outcomes and intend to make collaborative actions in these areas. They don't just interrogate for the sake of interrogation, that when we come together, we try to take action in an area of what you might call inequality. I found this language to be a way of relieving one stuck point. You might know the classic stuck point of like, how do I have an authentic role in this work? That's a classic stuck point in becoming a facilitator, because many people think, well, if I can't speak to experiences I've had as a member of X group or a member of X groups, then I don't have any role in this. But if you present, like Martín would say, the wicked problem first and say, where's your heart for change here? Almost the same way that your service learning centers have been doing for years. And then backtrack that conversation to, what is our conversation doing to materially affect those things, if that's where your heart is? Then some of the stuck points we run into when we think about who has authentic engagement, who has an authentic identity to do this work, that's what we're moving away from, because it doesn't functionally work. And so we often teach to the more, we often get Gen Z students who might say, great, you're going to teach power and privilege today too. That's going to be a part of your presentation, something some of you may be asked. And we say, sure. And we're going to teach it not just in terms of groups, but also in terms of experiences with systems that affect us all. So the educational system, housing systems. And so the classic example we use to teach this blue level is, all right, say you're wealthy in Washington, DC. Good for you. Try to buy any home that isn't affected by chemical pollutants. Go for it. Go for it. Go find a home that you can buy that isn't affected by the impact of the physical built environment. And so we start to break down the example of what does it mean to be wealthy? What is the onus of an individual? And what does it mean to actually work collaboratively on things like chemicals and water rather than kind of considering the individual onus of things? And so this is getting us unstuck from this conversation about who's marginalized, who's got privilege. It's a really boring conversation that many of you might agree with me on. This gives us an alternate question that I invite you into, which is how have we all intersected with climate? How have we all intersected with housing, transportation, homelessness? How have we all intersected with the wicked problems that face us? And that's not quite novel. This is literally just levels that you've seen in Brofenbrenner, an author. But for the Gen Z students I'm working with who need to be validated and that they are seeking justice, this is a really clear way to pick up the train and get it on a track that actually materially impacts lives in a way that reduces inequity, which is much more agreeable than just like revising our language. And then the final stuck point that we've gotten to is people using dialogue for everything. And so we've become clear in the last few years, and this is the final point, when to dialogue, when not to, when is the readiness not there? Again, I point you to our background in ethnic conflict, which is literally who are the three people from each side who are willing to not be violent with each other? For instance, Russia and Ukraine, who's willing to come to the table, not who's willing to fight. And so these clear criteria include things like, is there something more logical to do than hold a dialogue about this conflict? Is participating mutually beneficial to those involved? Have they actually opted into dialogue as a method of communication rather than debate or discussion? Have they opted into a multi-meeting experience in the diplomatic process? And one that seems to really stick with people here, organizers recruit participants who are not hostile, dehumanizing, invasive, or invalidating. This is controversial. Many people think, okay, well, if you don't have the KKK in the room, what's the point? We've actually started with this assumption that when you're trying to think of collaborative material actions and outcomes, there's enough choice work and deliberative work that everyday people need to do, that if everyone's attention is focused, for instance, on someone who's enrolled for closure about this issue, then the collaborative outcomes aren't going to be there. And so we've taken away that stuck point of, yeah, but my aunt so-and-so really needs to be here, and said, no, they probably need something else that they choose. But what does it mean for us to be the people who are here now? And so that's a small stuck point. Now that's, you might recognize that these four things, trying not to recruit someone who's actively hostile might be a safety question, literally physical safety question. We have been training folks for what do you do in these moments and how do you recognize a moment that's awkward from a moment that's truly degrading and dehumanizing. And so we've been in that world for a few years now, which has been really good work to spend time in. So for facilitators, what's the difference between someone saying, well, those people over there just need to do X, and someone saying, like, I really fundamentally don't believe in this, and I don't respect people as human beings if they identify this way. So the small gradations between the statements are all things that our facilitators are practicing on. Now, where are we getting stuck in teaching this that way? Some of the students, especially that we work with, but faculty and staff as well, are so entrenched in dogma that they're very much unable to tell the difference between something that significantly removes humanity from someone, and we use Dr. Marilyn Brewer's definition of dehumanization there. They can't tell the differences between something that might be a challenging point of view and something that's truly degrading or dehumanizing. And so we've been trying to spend a lot of time with how do you really differentiate between those things and not just throw them under the same blanket. All right, I probably am over time, so I will free us up, but thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Rhonda. And next, I believe we have Leslie, correct?
Yes, and I am going to share my screen. Let's see here. So I probably should have gone first because this is not going to be deep theory, which I so appreciate Martín and Rhonda and the space they hold in this work because they help move all of us forward in that way. We are an intermediary organization, meaning we do tons of things, and dialogue and deliberation is a piece of it. So mine is it said that we could be really, really practical. So mine is extremely practical. And I'm just going to tell you sort of some lessons learned from trying to build this work on campuses and get buy-in. So the way that I like to first introduce or think about this work is Dorisa Grant. I hope you all saw her article in Inside Higher Education on difficult conversations. And she was really pushing back on this idea that, you know, this is difficult, challenging, let's just avoid having these identity questions, these political questions. And I just really practically, she said, what if these conversations are not actually difficult, but simply unpracticed? And so my work these days, particularly with administrators, is to make the case that this is not, there's no opportunity to opt out of this, right? We know, particularly with the polarization issues that we're having, I actually had to bring together administrators to do scenario planning as we anticipated violence around the election. We'll be doing that again. So there's the polarization issue, but then there's also the demographic shifts that we know are happening in higher education, right? Where we're getting folks with very different backgrounds. So I'll just start there. I'll also say one of the biggest issues that we have discovered that we have aided in here at Campus Compact is we started introducing methods without folks actually doing the work of the why. And so just want to share the learning that we now try to help folks think about the purpose and goals and the learning outcomes, the audience, their capacity, the length, the depth, the breadth of it before they dive into dialogue. What we discovered was we started introducing the National Issues Forum, which is an incredible choice word public deliberation tool. And, but it, you know, gives choices and trade-offs, and it's fairly intensive in terms of people coming into the room and understanding what exactly is involved. And so we've begun to step back and introduce folks to living room conversations, civic dinners, other methods that are more, I'm not going to call them a continuum as much as it's this circle of sort of dialogue, deliberation. But I'm sure most folks are familiar with this tool. It's from 2005, but we still continue to help our campuses use it just as a starting point. And it's the streams framework that they give, and the question of what are your actual goals, which at the time they divided into sort of first order, second order, third order. But I still think that it's a valuable framing for campuses to step back and ask, what exactly, or a faculty member in their course, what exactly am I trying to accomplish by using this particular method? So you see things like, is this just, I want them to learn about the issue? I have a faculty member at Queen's University in Charlotte who has used dialogue, and particularly the National Issues Forum model, for a decade in her course on immigration, because it's a place to start raising questions and the issue. And then of course, there's the increasing civic capacity and that sort of thing. Within their framework, and this is very, very outdated in terms of the different models, but they do talk about, is this exploration, conflict transformation, decision-making, collaborative action, and within that, there are various methods that will help folks get to that place. Also, again, I kind of talked about this, but we really are trying to help our campuses think about, and I think Rhonda may have talked about this, is this a dialogue or is this deliberation? Like what are we trying to move for folks towards? Of course, dialogue can be very intense and have lots of skills that are gained, but we tend to think of it more as a place to have difficult conversations across differences, or to understand an issue better, understand perspective, whereas deliberation moves in a different direction. And so the tool that we use to help folks think about it when they come into the room for one of our deliberations or deliberative conversation is what was developed by Oregon State. And I if you're not familiar with the resource, I've enjoyed it as they try to make a distinction between debate, dialogue, and deliberation. So this idea of, are we competing, exchanging, or are we weighing options together? And so at least for my part, my goal is with whatever method, if you're creating your own, whatever you're doing, I do think that there are key elements. All of them don't have to be involved, but having some facilitation skills, and obviously Rhonda talked more about some things to consider there, but this idea of the intention, who needs to be in the room, or how do I set this up in terms of the prep work, always having the ground rules and the agreements, and then of course we can move towards thoughtful decision-making together. But for folks, if you're not already familiar with Nancy Thomas's work at IDHE, we have hosted several workshops using this model that she's creating to help faculty learn how to have these sort of political conversations. So if you're not familiar with this particular tool, she, of course, challenges all faculty and folks in higher ed to try to have some basic facilitation skills, but at a minimum, the ability to frame, right? What are we talking about, and to organize it, and then to manage the discussions. But what I really appreciate about her is some of the questions that she challenges folks. So the actual tool, that was the article that I showed before, is Facilitating Political Discussions, a Facilitator Training Workshop Guide. And it's designed so that you can actually host the workshop for your faculty. And one of the things she talks a lot about is that you need to have a conscious decision about anticipated pedagogical choices in a discussion. And some of these question prompts that you need to think about before you do it is, should all perspectives get a fair hearing? I think Rhonda was alluding to some of this too. Even if they reflect ideas antithetical to learning, right? Should beliefs that contradict established science or evidence get a full hearing? And these are, of course, choice points you need to make before you have these discussions, particularly in the classroom. Do feelings belong in a deliberation? Should discussion leaders and teachers aspire to be neutral? And if so, what does that mean? And so I have found these, when we've done the workshops with folks from across the state, to be really essential for a faculty member to lead these sort of discussions with confidence, and to also really have a clear idea about how they are going to approach some of these stuck points that we've been talking about. I also want, there's so many new tools now that, again, as we go back to what is the most effective for you, I'm just going to share a few that some you may not be familiar with. I think most of us know living room conversations, but Candidly Speaking is a new model that came out during the pandemic out in California, and we had her present her work to us, and I just want to lift it up because I think it's an interesting model. I will also say that I have moved exclusively online. And so if you want to practice some of this, you can also be part of those. We've also introduced folks to Socrates Cafe, Democracy Cafe. And I again, want to lift that up as an important tool. Civic Dinners is now inclusive. They've changed their name. But Aristotle's Cafe is a model developed by a person that lives here in North Carolina. And so he is more than willing to come to your campus to help facilitate these conversations. And this is more of an open space model where folks walk in and develop the question together that they want to ponder in the space. And then the idea is that hopefully they'll continue to gather over time to gain those skills in just different topics and perspectives. Essential Partners, if you're not familiar, they have some really incredible tools and guides. And then Civil Dialogue is a model out of Arizona State that we introduced our folks to at our Civic Engagement Institute. This is the one where you have the continuum, agree, strongly disagree, and you have the chair set up. Folks decide together when they come, what is the question going to be? And then people have to sort of stake their claim, go sit in one of those and then share why they're there. You hear from the audience questions. So I always lift that one up because I love the model. I have one of my community colleges that has started using it. And I just think it's powerful to have folks try to explain really their position on these key critical issues. I want to lift up Braver Angels model. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. They used to be Better Angels, and they are specifically about the red-blue divide, very intentional. You have to stake your claim, which side you consider yourself to be on. But I'm lifting this up because we are partnering with them here at North Carolina Campus Compact to launch a new campus-based model called Braver Discussions. Doing this with the Braver Angels Alliance of Central North Carolina, and we are actually seeking campuses. And then of course, bring it to the table. But I want to lift up Citizen Connect if folks aren't familiar with this new tool that was developed last year that's online and has tons and tons of different dialogue models and organizations that have emerged in the last few years. I'm sure many of you have noticed that this idea of bridging organizations and weaving and folks who are trying to bridge the divide has grown exponentially in the last few years. Also want to just point out that we're seeing a lot of movement on our campuses around using the arts to prompt dialogue. And so I know we sponsored the Reunited States on multiple campuses around the state who, and it's of course about trying to deal with political polarization. Then there's obviously the film Bring It to the Table that goes along with the model. And there are tons more films that are specifically about voter suppression and some of these. So if you definitely want to go and really discuss specific issues, then you can, there's lots of films out there. And then of course, there's Theater of the Oppressed and all sorts of other theater-based tools that can spark dialogue and continue the conversation. And then of course, you've heard from Sustained Dialogue. I hope you're familiar with Everyday Democracy. There's Intergroup Dialogue and the National Issues Forum. But the National Issues Forum has a brand new issue guide about policing that I've been part of some of those conversations and some of the work to move that forward. And so I want to really encourage people, if that's an issue in your community, to take a look at that. And there is a training coming up on February 17th about moderating these sorts of dialogues. But I wanted to spend just a second here to say the ways that our campuses have been using the National Issues Forum model. So Elon University, twice a year, they actually pick a topic and open it up to the entire campus to come one evening and have a dialogue together. And so they have ongoing training throughout the year for faculty, students, and staff to actually gain the skills to be able to facilitate these conversations. But there's always a big one in spring, big one in the fall, and they work through professors to get their students there. Queen's University of Charlotte requires a dialogue for all their first-year students to come in and gain those skills as they arrive. Warren Wilson College used the model to first just have a dialogue, and then they're small enough, they closed the whole campus down, and the entire campus participated in a dialogue of an issue guide they created themselves about how to become a welcoming environment for all. And then I hope that folks have seen the work that Wake Forest has done. They started an initiative years ago and actually did a longitudinal study a decade later. And this was an intensive program where students did 4 years of deliberative dialogues in various forms that culminated in them actually creating the issue guide and facilitating in the local community. 10 years later, they looked back and saw how incredibly nuanced folks' communication was around politics, how they thought about issues, and just their ability to communicate across difference. And it was pretty remarkable. And so just one more about key elements. I know that Martín talked about this. And so for us, this values idea, we actually have sort of stolen from him and some others, the way that we introduce the values piece before we start our dialogues, because values come into play so heavily in this work that we want people to have a conversation up front, right? So we use the whole, these are the values uplifted in the preamble. We do some current phrasing of it, as we've seen some other folks do. And then we have people actually in the space rank order. And then we have a discussion about it. So that we start before our dialogues always recognizing the power of our values, and yet how in many ways we have arrived at those priorities in different ways, but it doesn't mean that we devalue some of these other things. We just have prioritized them differerently. And so what does that then mean for politics and public problem solving? Obviously, there are other value frameworks. Jonathan Haidt and Kettering has one, all fairly similar words, but just wanted to introduce that we start our dialogues there, so that as, and then of course, as we're going through them, we always say, what do you think the person that agrees with this way of looking at this, what do you think they value? And so it helps us, help our students in particular, step back to think about that we all have these values we hold dearly and why, and how that, of course, informs how we think about things. And then, of course, we do a lot of work around the trade-off concept. And we start with the minimum wage question, right? So it's $7.25 here now. If we increase it to 15, what are the trade-offs? And try to help people wrestle with those kind of things. So these are just really practical. This kind of goes back to what Rhonda said. One thing we also are very clear with our campuses about is that deliberation and dialogue is just one method for solving problems. Some of these are technical. If the bridge is broken, fix it. Sometimes we just need to educate folks. There's advocacy and activism. And then, of course, there are legal remedies. We need to sue them if, in fact, the water has poisoned our children. And so one of the other pieces that I'm really leaning into more is trying to help faculty actually practice themselves. I find that for a lot of faculty, they only have these conversations in their classroom, and there really are lots and lots of ways to do more of this. So for instance, the National Issues Forum has an online forums initiative, Common Ground for Action, that's constant. And you can just go in and you can have conversations with people across the world and gain some more skills around having these kind of conversations. There is now a national movement, and I'm hoping that higher ed will continue to be part of it. There's a Listen First project, and there are about 350 organizations and folks, we're at that table, who are trying to do bridging work and weaving work across the nation. There's the Bridge Alliance, there's the Weave, the Social Fabric Project from an Aspen Institute. And now there are these big days of dialogue. So America Talks is coming up in April, it'll be the 5th annual. And then the Listen First project has a national week of conversation that follows that. And I was actually part of some of those America Talks conversations, and I would talk with somebody from California who's on a totally different side of the aisle than I am. And it was really important for me to keep working on those skills. And then there's now the National Day of Dialogue. The first one was last week. And so that will be coming again January 5th. So this is just very, very practical in terms of those of us that do this work, trying to help us think about ways to move it forward, particular tools. So I hope there was something that folks can take away from that. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. And finally, we have Ryan Solomon.
Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and have the opportunity to share my thoughts to many people who in this Zoom call who have been an important influence on me, and who I value their insights. I really, as I offer my thoughts today, which I have written because I've wanted to get my language right, and I'm going to read to you, I want you to please listen to what I have to say through the wisdom of that has been offered by the previous speakers, who I think refract what I'm saying in important ways. And again, I want to emphasize this is a very personal thing that I've been thinking through and struggling with. And I value the fact that I'm being provided an opportunity to think through this in a different way. So I speak today as an advocate for public dialogue and deliberation, which I value as a key means to strengthen democratic communities. What I've come to learn over the years is that conflict and dissonance are an inherent element of dialogue, which means that some polarization is an inescapable part of democratic life. The challenge is to stay committed to democratic values of inclusion and equality in the face of that conflict, which is why I'm worried about the fact that those values are being so profoundly called into question at the moment. What I want to argue today is that in order to reinforce the democratic aspects of dialogue, it is necessary to emphasize both inclusion and equality. Too often I have seen calls for inclusion, usually expressed in the language of balance, neutrality, and nonpartisanship, come at the expense of demands for equality. One outcome of this is the creation of a false equivalence between different political perspectives, with the result that they are given equal weight, even, for instance, when one side is driving an anti-democratic agenda. In this way, differences, for instance, between the January 6th insurrections of white supremacists in Charlottesville and Black Lives Matter activists are elided. After all, these are all good people on both sides. I'm very wary in expressing this concern because I care about democratic dialogue, which means I care about nuance and not making sweeping generalizations that can be easily misinterpreted. And to be honest, I'm still working to articulate and appropriately name this concern, which has been building over the past few years of facilitating campus and community dialogues. And in the spirit of dialogue, I welcome pushback and hope you will be able to help me consider my concerns from another perspective. And I really think that that's happened for me today. So let me see if I can effectively describe some of the sources of my concern. While I was working as a faculty member at Collegiate University before I came to the University of Chicago, I was fortunate to be involved in a range of dialogue initiatives, including anti-racism workshops on campus and in the community. In particular, I taught a dialogue-focused public speaking course. Because of the conflict and animosity that followed the election of Donald Trump, I decided that I wanted to use that course to create space for political dialogue amongst my students. So I created a speech assignment of my own design where students laid out their core political beliefs and values and engaged in a range of dialogue exercises. I created this assignment because I was wary of my students' tendency to avoid talking about political issues, in part because they were actively discouraged from doing so, and in part because they were wary of being attacked for their political stances. The inability to talk openly and productively about our political differences seemed to me to be a crucial reason for the growing political division in America. I'll be honest that this desire for political dialogue sprang from naive peacemaking instincts that have bedeviled much of the dialogue work that I've done. There was lots that was challenging about that political dialogue work I did with students. For instance, students avoided telling the truth about their political positions, usually in the case of students who voted for Donald Trump, as well as raising concerns early on about the way my own political perspective was hampering their willingness to speak up. Despite these challenges, I learned a great deal from my students. Unsurprisingly, my students were critical of the political binary that defines American life. They resisted prevailing political labels, Democrat and Republican, red and blue, which didn't work for them. They spoke of intergenerational divides that made it hard for them to identify with prevailing framing of political issues. They expressed their skepticism about American political processes and elected leaders. Ultimately, they felt like they were being forced into uncomfortable boxes that didn't reflect the complexity of their political beliefs. And in valuable ways, our dialogue together provided them the means to escape some of the constraints of those boxes. But this dialogue work, which sought to make students aware of the social structures maintaining those political boxes, also reinforced my concerns about the problem of false equivalence in moments of dialogue. So let me provide an example. One of my students, a soft-spoken young man from Detroit, gave a thoughtful speech on the challenges of being a conservative student on campus in the wake of the 2016 election. He spoke eloquently of feeling like he was marginalized and silenced. He highlighted the discrepancy between faculty who identified as Democrat versus Republican on campus, and provided cogent examples of knee-jerk criticism he received if he even risked mentioning his political affiliation. So he stopped saying anything political. In speaking to commonplaces about the wokeness of college campuses, he offered a nuanced personal perspective of the dangers of overzealous policing of politics on campuses. Still, it was interesting to see the conflict bubbling under the surface in class in response to his speech. Many white students nodded their heads. Many students of color were visibly frustrated. Everyone listened carefully, though, to someone that they had gotten to know well and respected. We had already learned of his love for animals, which put him on the path of veterinary medicine, and his incredible skill as a photographer. Most importantly, we had listened empathetically as he had earlier struggled to share his experience with a learning disability, which nearly derailed his college plans and his obvious talent. Yet his concerns about political marginalization needed some context, which was provided by a Korean student who had previously given a heartfelt account of navigating Korean gender dynamics as a young woman. Barely holding back her tears, she listed the repeated ways she had been discriminated against on campus. For example, she spoke pointedly about being ignored by alumni who flocked around white students at networking events on campus. In doing so, she reminded the class of the way that students of color were consistently silenced and ignored, including during their recent protests. She concluded by underlining that even as she recognized the painfulness of having one's political voice silenced on campus, the experience of this conservative student in this moment differed in kind to the long-standing inequalities faced by women and students of color who were finally calling for political accountability in the context of a presidency that valued their concerns. Importantly, my Korean student was not playing into a politics of victimhood with the aim of ranking forms of marginalization against one another. She was simply calling for conservative students in the class to translate their own experience of victimhood into empathy for students of color whose material experience of campus is and continues to be vastly different from white students. and Donald Trump's uniquely demeaning political platform wasn't helping. I want to recognize the valuable parts of this dialogue work, despite the mistakes I made, which provided students a space to engage in more considerate, more nuanced discussion of political issues. But in that dialogue work, I saw habits that have been a consistent pattern of dialogue work I have done, whereby participants in positions of advantage and power demand balance and disregard demands for equity from marginalized participants. This has been especially true in conversations about race, and I don't think it's viable to talk about politics in America without talking about issues of race. I continually see white participants in those conversations react defensively, shut down, play themselves as victims, and accuse people of color of being racist, even as they assert that issues of race or identity politics have no place in political discussions. In doing so, they claim that people of color, in seeking to bring up issues of racial inequality, are being uncivil and creating unnecessary polarization. The end result is to set the terms of dialogue. What I mean by that is they're basically saying we can only talk if you promise to be nice and don't offend me, which circumscribes the possibility of having an honest conversation about race in America. Most worrying for me is that the Republican Party has been translating these attitudes into an institutionalized political practice. The most profound example is their current railing against critical race theory, which is impossible to engage fairly with because it is a straw person that serves only to rile up their base. Not only does disingenuous criticism of critical race theory play white people off as victims, but it makes it seem like calling for accountability for institutional racism in America is itself an injustice, which is a form of gaslighting. All of this instead of thoughtfully and fairly engaging with the concerns of Black Americans. In conclusion, this politicization of dialogue, especially in the case of the Republican Party, presents two major concerns to me. One, it risks making a neutral stance in dialogue a kind of acquiescence, especially in the case of discussions of voting reform in America currently. And two, it makes me anxious about making polarization itself the problem, which inevitably leads to more cause for civility, when what I really think we need is to realize that there are different forms of polarization that need to be treated differently. And more importantly, we need to help students build the resilience they need to dwell in uncomfortable, conflicted dialogue that necessarily brings about dissonance, rather than reinforcing their belief that conflict is inherently a bad thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you all, Martín, Rhonda, Leslie, and Ryan, for 4 really great thought-provoking presentations. So thank you very much.